Hey, well, good evening, everybody. Glad that you could join us tonight as we launch into our new series, Real Jesus. Who is the real Jesus of history? Now, at the heart of Christianity is a central question: who is Jesus? It may be astounding to some that such a question is still relevant after nearly 2 millennia of Christian activity, but as strange as it may seem, even Christians don't agree about the nature of the founder of Christianity. This fact says a great deal about those who profess to be Christian, which at its most basic means follower of Christ. If Christians display such profound disagreement about Jesus, can we all really be following the same person? This evening, we'll begin to answer the question, who is the real Jesus of history, by digging into Mark's gospel. The writer of this gospel is a fellow by the name of John Mark. And now he's not one of the 12 disciples, and so he's not to be confused with John the Apostle. Rather, he was the cousin of Barnabas and the son of a woman named Mary, whose home was used as a meeting place in the early church, as you can read about in Acts chapter 12. Now, some think that he may have been the young man who fled into the night during Jesus' arrest, and so was most likely one of the outer ring of disciples, the 70, who followed Jesus. He accompanied Barnabas and Paul on their first missionary journey, which, got to tell you, wasn't a resounding success for Mark, however, and he ended up leaving the two missionaries to go home. Later on, that action of Mark causes a rift between Paul and Barnabas when they were about to embark on another missionary journey. You see, Barnabas wants Mark to join them again, but Paul refuses because Mark had quit on them earlier. So serious was the difference between them that Paul and Barnabas actually split company, and as far as we know, never worked together again. Now, for some years, Mark vanishes from history, but when he does resurface, it's in, I think, a most surprising and a refreshing way. We learn, much to our surprise and delight, that when Paul wrote the letter to the Colossians from prison in Rome, Mark's there with them. In another prison letter, Philemon, Paul numbers Mark among his fellow workers. And when Paul was waiting to be executed for his faith near the end, he wrote to Timothy, who was his right-hand man, these words: "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful for me for ministry." I mean, it's a far cry from the time when Paul dismissed Mark as a quitter. Whatever had happened, Mark had become the one man that Paul wanted at the end of his life. Now, Mark wrote his gospel probably around the mid-60s AD, which would place it about 30 years after the events that he's describing. And it's clear from the details that he includes that his writing is based on eyewitness accounts. And according to the early sources, Mark was actually writing down the eyewitness accounts of Peter, who happens to have been Jesus' closest friend. And as he writes these words down, he answers three important questions. Who is Jesus? Why did Jesus come? And how should we respond? So our hope and our prayer for you is that as we embark on this book study, we'll not only ask these questions, but we're going to discover for ourselves the answers as well. Now, we call this the gospel according to Mark. If you've been around me for any length of time, you notice that I use the word gospel a lot in my sermons and in my conversations. When I see the news, I'll often say, the gospel is the answer, or the gospel is the hope of the world. In my messages, or when we share communion, you'll often hear me say, the gospel means that we're free from the penalty of sin, free from the power of sin, and one day we're going to be free from the presence of sin. That's the gospel, church. Now, you might ask why I'm so into that word. Well, the actual word gospel means good news that is announced, making it quite different from other religious messages, which might be called good advice to be followed. Now, the good news is that we are so lost and broken that we can't even find God or fix ourselves. So God came himself as a man named Jesus, to find us and to save us and to reunite us with our Heavenly Father. And the gospel, the good news, is that being reunited with God doesn't depend on our own efforts or even the strength and sincerity of our faith, because if it was, it'd never be good enough. The good news then is that it's not the quality of our faith that saves us, but the quality of the one in whom we put our faith, Jesus. Okay, so where do we go from here? Possessing a mere fascination about Jesus isn't enough to fulfill, nor will it enact his life-altering work. I mean, curiosity is good, but it should drive fervent searching. Now, in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, we're introduced to a guy who can't help himself. And the people around him are powerless to help him as well. In fact, they're all slaves to the circumstances they're in. Their situation seems hopeless from a human perspective, but then they meet Jesus, and everything changes. Those three questions that Mark asks are presented and then answered in this situation. Who is he? Why did he come? And how do they, or in this case, we, respond? So let's take a look at Mark chapter 5, and we're going to read starting at verse 1. We'll read all of 20 verses throughout the message this evening, but we'll just start at verses 1 to 13 at the beginning. So they arrived at the other side of the lake in the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus climbed out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the burial caves and could no longer be restrained, even with a chain. Whenever he's put into chains and shackles, as he often was, he snapped the chains from his wrists and he smashed the shackles. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Day and night he wandered among the burial caves and in the hills, howling and cutting himself with sharp stones. When Jesus was still some distance away, the man saw him, ran to meet him, and bowed low before him. With a shriek he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In the name of God, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already said to the spirit, "Come out of the man, you evil spirit." Then Jesus demanded, "What's your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us inside this man." Then the evil spirits begged him again and again not to send them to some distant place. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby. "Send us into those pigs," the spirit begged. "Let us enter them." So Jesus gave them permission. The evil spirits came out of the man and entered the pigs. And the entire herd of about 2,000 pigs plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned in the water. And this is the reading of God's word. It appears that the people around this poor guy had tried their best to restrain him with shackles and chains, and it seemed that they did for a time, but these man-made devices couldn't hold him down anymore. I mean, they used to, but not now, and that's because he was increasingly getting stronger. Now, by this point in the story, it's like he had superhuman strength, which was probably a big reason that anyone who cared about him couldn't help him anymore. So increasingly, it seems that they left him alone, cutting themselves off from his life. It's kind of like the ancient form of social media unfriend. So imagine how desperate this man was. He's up there in that graveyard alone, meaning that essentially to the world and to himself, he's nothing but a dead man. His humanity's been stripped from him, which is why we would see him naked and running around like a wild man. He cuts himself and his body's covered with blood and scars. He screams and yells in his torment. He's more animal than man by this point. Well, there's only one cure for his condition. He didn't need another prescription. A psychiatrist wasn't going to help. Chains around his wrists obviously didn't stop him. And I don't think a 12-step program was the answer. Simply put, this guy needed Jesus. See, it's only Jesus who transforms so completely, and that's the gospel. Listen, church, Jesus is the waymaker. He's the life bringer, the identity giver, the dignity provider. What is dead, Jesus brings to life. So let me ask you a question. How's your marriage? Is it dead or dying? Well, guess what? Jesus can bring it to life. Do you feel the weight of sin in your life? Has it got its hold on you? Are you feeling crushed under the weight of guilt? Jesus is the life giver. Jesus can break the chains that bind us, and he can set us free, just as he did for this guy. No matter where you are in your life, no matter how deep you feel that you've sinned, no matter how deep in despair you are or hopeless you might feel, Jesus is the one who can transform your situation, and he can turn your life around. So, if you want freedom, if you sincerely want change, start with Jesus. You see, a transformed life starts with Jesus. Now, in this story that I just read to you, we're told that the guy's possessed by a legion of demons. Now, a legion in the Roman army was anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 men. So, in other words, there's a whole lot of demons inside this poor fella. Which is why this guy was out of control and why everyone in that region feared him. I mean, they fled in terror when he came near. Children were warned to beware of that crazy man in the graveyard. Everyone avoided him. Everyone, that is, but Jesus. That's because Jesus sees people with a different set of eyes than we do. We see their sins and their issues, but he sees what he can make of their lives. We might see an alcoholic, but he sees an elder. We see a drug addict. He sees a worshiper. We see somebody with anger issues. He sees a compassionate heart. I mean, lives are transformed when they come to Jesus. He'll take what you give him and he'll give you something so much more in return. Give yourself to Jesus and you're going to be amazed at what he'll do with you. We see that everything this guy had tried to do to get a grip in his own sanity had just proven useless. But one word from Jesus and he was free. And that's because, as we see in this story, everything, including evil spirits, are subject to Jesus. They even recognize his authority. In fact, they must have his permission to do the things they do, because Jesus is the master, even of the demons. And you know what that does for us, church? That gives us hope today. Because it often looks like evil is winning, doesn't it? But the truth of the matter is that it's not. In fact, you go to Revelation 20, the last book in the Bible itself, and it tells us that Satan's going to be cast into the lake of fire. In other words, we know the end of the story. Jesus wins. Satan can't even enter a pig without God's approval. And that's the glory of Jesus and his transforming power. I mean, humanity can try religious works, but they all fail to change us completely in our deepest selves. Humanity tries pop psychology, but it'll fall far short of changing the heart of a sinner. Humanity can try pills or programs, but that'll never completely change the lives of those lost in sin. A transformed life starts with Jesus. There is only one solution to the problem of sin. Jesus. There's only one hope for a messed up world. Jesus. There's only one hope for those trapped in a life of sin. Jesus. That's why we say that the gospel is the answer, because it is the only answer that completely presents a solution to the problems we see and experience in this messed up world. A transformed life starts with Jesus. Secondly, we should also know that a transformed life is a life that will be disturbed, which means that you'll never be the same. Often the thought is that once we find Jesus and once he transforms my life, everything is going to be great from then on in, and we're going to be skipping through a field of roses. You know what? There is some truth to that. I mean, life inside begins to change, and we experience a love and a joy and a peace and a patience and kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control in ways and in depths that we never had before. And that's because we're being changed. We're new creations. It's the process of sanctification. Sanctification, of course, is the journey of being made more and more into the image of Jesus. But until we reach eternity, while living in this sin-filled and broken world, we're going to continue to face difficulties. We're going to continue to face a life of disruptions. And because we're still battling sin, our lives are going to be disrupted as a result of the transformation that takes place. In verses 14 to 16, you can just see how much disruption was going on in that Jesus had caused to everybody involved. Let's take a look at these verses. Mark 5, 14 to 16. The herdsmen fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. People rushed out to see what had happened. A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons. He was sitting there fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were all afraid. Then those who had seen what had happened told the others about the demon-possessed man and the pigs. I mean, you would have thought that everybody would have started praising Jesus for this great and wonderful thing. I mean, this man who they couldn't control was now all of a sudden changed. But no, they talk about the change in the man. But it's interesting that they also talk about the pigs. The pigs seem to be as much of a focal point as the man's transformation. Now, why would that be? It's because they're upset. They're afraid. Now, why? Well, often a battle cry of humanity is, please don't disrupt my life. On the whole, the one thing people want is to be left alone. Now, in this particular situation, they were upset because they lost their livelihood. In other words, the transformation of this man's life cost them in their checking account. I mean, the little piggies didn't go to the market, nor did the little piggies run all the way home. The little piggies in this story ran all the way over a cliff, and they didn't like that. But it certainly got their attention. Listen, church, following Jesus will cost us. In fact, there may be times where your life is going to be completely disrupted in order to get your attention, just as it was disrupted in these people's lives. But we need to understand that in the economy of God's kingdom, we need to lose in order to gain. Jesus said in Luke, if you try to hang on to your life, you're going to lose it. But if you give up on your life for my sake, you're going to save it. And when that happens, when you lose because of Jesus, how will you respond? Listen, you can tell a lot about where you and I are in relation to the depth of our faith by seeing what we hold on to is most important in our life. I mean, you can save me, Jesus, just don't disrupt my life and don't make it cost me, well, at least too much. But in verse 15, we see that this guy welcomed the disruption in his life. And as a result, we see that he's no longer running around naked and crying out and cutting himself. Now he's clothed and calm, and he's seated beside Jesus. Finally, after who knows how many years, this guy is in his right mind. I mean, where there had been turmoil and agitation, there's now perfect peace. He's been changed spiritually and physically and mentally. Jesus literally gives everyone he saves a brand new life. I mean, we often talk about the miracle of life, don't we? But this is the miracle of a new life. You can't meet Jesus and stay the same. That's the point. He disrupts the lives and changes all those who come to him. And the change is always for the best, even if it doesn't look like that to us in the moment. Now, but in this story, even though the guy is fixed, look at how the community reacted to this disruption in verse 17. And the crowd began pleading with Jesus to go away and leave them alone. I mean, here they're demanding that Jesus leave their country. I mean, they might have been able to handle a little preaching, but when Jesus started transforming lives and costing them money, well, that was just too much. The people wanted Jesus to leave. But it's interesting to see how the man who has just been saved, his reaction, you see, he wants to be with Jesus. You see that in verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Now that's what happens when your life is transformed by Jesus. It's disrupted and changed so completely that it'll ruin you. In the most wonderful ways, of course. The miracle of a transformed life changes you so entirely that when you get saved and your heart is right with Jesus, you'll love him and you'll love his people more than what you thought you had or imagined you were in the past. Wherever Jesus is, that's where you'll want to be too. Which is why a transformed life is and increasingly becomes then a life on mission. Now, instead of letting the guy hang out with him in a holy huddle, as it were, Jesus sends the man on mission back to his home to tell his family and friends about what had happened to him. And that's where we need to begin. In verses 19 to 20, we read this, but Jesus said, "No, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been." So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. This man owned Jesus' vision, and he lived out the mission so convincingly that when Jesus comes back to that very part of the country later on, he has a completely different reception from the one he received on this occasion. The next time, he's actually very well received, and he performs many miracles, including the famous feeding of the 4,000 people with only 7 loaves and a few small fish. So, but can you picture in your mind in the interim how this scene must have played out when he went out on this mission for Jesus? The people see this formerly possessed man coming and they cringe in fear again. Children hide behind their mothers. Doors are slammed shut and people run in fear to hide from the madman. But wait. So, I mean, something is different today. I mean, yeah, it's still him. He still bears the scars on his body, but the look in his eye, it's different. There's a twinkle there. He isn't screaming. Now he's talking about a man named Jesus. He's not running around like a wild man. He's calm and he's sane and he's talking about how this guy, Jesus, has transformed him completely. What a difference Jesus makes. Oh, you know what? People might argue with us about our beliefs, but they can't debate nor deny our testimonies. Nothing is more powerful than the testimony of a changed life. In fact, church, the unanswerable proof of Christianity is a transformed life. The gospel is the hope of the world, which is why we celebrate communion, because it is Jesus who we remember as the one who brought the gospel to a hurting world, including us. This evening in our live service, we're celebrating the Lord's Supper, or another word for it is communion. Communion is about remembering the fact that Jesus became a man who lived an ordinary human life, distinguished only by the startling fact that he never did anything wrong. He kept all of God's laws, both internally and externally, and having done so, he transferred all the credit for that obedience to those who love and trust him. Now, in addition to giving us the credit for his perfect life and obedience, Jesus went further and willingly took the punishment that was due to us for our imperfect, rebellious lives. Dying on the cross, he forgave all those who were killing him. We were the ones killing him, by the way. And so he forgave us too. When he rose from the dead, Jesus demonstrated that death had no hold on him, nor on any who entrusted their lives and soul to him. That also means that all he promised us is a sure thing. And one day, as he promised, he'll return just as he said. Now, the gospel is beautifully displayed in the Lord's Supper. The bread symbolizes his broken body, and the cup represents his blood shed for the forgiveness of sins. Because of his broken body and because of his blood being shed, we not only are freed from the penalty of sin if we commit our lives to following Jesus as our Lord and Savior, but it also reminds us that we are being freed from the power of sin today. And one day when he does return, we'll finally be free from the presence of sin utterly and completely. Now, in this passage from Mark's Gospel, we saw how Jesus transformed a man who was dead and made him alive. He saved the man who was possessed and he set him free. You know what? He can do that for you too. What possesses you today? Are you lost and in the grip of sin? Well, Jesus can set you free. Are you out of God's will and trapped in pride and bitterness? Well, Jesus can set you free. Do you need his touch? Do you need his compassion? Do you need his life-changing power? Come and know the real Jesus. He'll create new life in places that are dead. I mean, this is the gospel, church, the hope of the world and the hope for you and me. God bless. Have a great week. You are loved.